The yellow school bus doors slammed shut with a metallic clang as 8-year-old Zara Williams and her younger brother Malik stood helpless on the sidewalk, their backpacks heavy with homework they would never complete on time. Driver Frank Morrison's cruel laughter echoed through the morning air as he accelerated away, leaving 2 black children stranded 3 miles from Lincoln Elementary. What Morrison didn't know was that their mother, Dr. Keisha Williams, was already reaching for her Department of Transportation badge while her phone buzzed with the school's automated attendance alert. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Keisha Williams had built her life on the principle that excellence was the most effective response to discrimination. At 34, she held the position of Regional Transportation Safety Director for the Department of Transportation, overseeing school bus operations across 6 counties in North Carolina. Her office walls displayed certificates from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a master's degree in public administration from Howard University, and commendations from state officials who recognized her innovative approaches to student transportation safety. The journey to this position had required navigating obstacles that her white colleagues never faced. Keisha understood that as a black woman in government leadership, her competence would be questioned at every level, her decisions scrutinized more intensely than those of her peers, and her authority challenged by individuals who could not accept her rightful place in positions of power. This reality had shaped her approach to professional excellence, driving her to exceed expectations consistently, while building unassailable expertise in transportation policy and safety regulations. Her commitment to public service stemmed from personal experience with educational inequality. Growing up in rural Georgia during the 1990s, Keisha had witnessed how transportation barriers prevented black children from accessing quality education. Unreliable bus service, discriminatory policies, and neglected routes in minority neighborhoods created systemic disadvantages that limited educational opportunities for entire communities. These experiences had motivated her to pursue a career where she could address transportation equity directly. The decision to move to Chapel Hill, North Carolina had been strategic. The position with the Department of Transportation offered opportunities to implement comprehensive reforms that could serve as models for other states. More importantly, the location provided access to excellent schools for her children, Zara and Malik, within a community that appeared more progressive than the rural environments where she had experienced overt discrimination during her childhood. Keisha's daily routine reflected her commitment to both professional excellence and family responsibilities. She typically arrived at her office by 7 in the morning, allowing her to review overnight incident reports and coordinate with district transportation supervisors before the morning bus routes commenced. Her comprehensive understanding of routing systems, driver training protocols, and federal safety regulations had earned respect from colleagues who initially questioned her qualifications based on preconceived assumptions about her background and capabilities. The challenges of single parenthood added complexity to her professional responsibilities. Zara's father had left when their daughter was 3 years old, unable to handle the demands of dating someone whose career ambitions exceeded his own expectations for women. Malik's father had proven equally unreliable, disappearing entirely when their son was born. These experiences had reinforced Keisha's determination to achieve financial independence and professional recognition that could provide security for her children regardless of external circumstances. Her children had become her primary motivation for pursuing excellence in every aspect of her career. Zara, now 8 years old, displayed exceptional academic abilities and leadership qualities that reminded Keisha of her own childhood ambitions. Malik, at 6 years old, possessed a gentle spirit and creative intelligence that required nurturing through stable educational environments. Both children understood that their mother's work involved protecting other children's access to education through safe and reliable transportation services. The Lincoln Elementary School District had initially impressed Keisha with its reputation for academic excellence and diversity initiatives. The school's demographics showed a balanced representation of different racial and ethnic groups, suggesting an environment where her children could thrive without facing the isolation she had experienced in predominantly white educational settings. The transportation services appeared well organized, with newer buses and comprehensive route coverage throughout the district. However, subtle signs of underlying problems had emerged during her children's first months at Lincoln Elementary. Zara had mentioned that certain bus drivers seemed less friendly to black students, requiring them to follow stricter behavioral guidelines than their white classmates. Malik had reported that some drivers would skip stops in predominantly black neighborhoods when buses were crowded, forcing children to walk longer distances to alternative pickup locations. Keisha had initially attributed these reports to typical childhood misunderstandings of adult behavior. Her professional experience included numerous interactions with transportation personnel who faced legitimate challenges in managing student behavior and maintaining schedule adherence. She understood that drivers often dealt with difficult situations that required firm discipline and consistent rule enforcement across all student populations. The morning of October 15th began like every other school day in the Williams household. Keisha prepared breakfast while reviewing transportation incident reports on her tablet, noting increasing complaints about driver behavior in several districts under her supervision. Zara and Malik completed their morning routines with the efficiency that Keisha had taught them, understanding that punctuality and preparation were essential for success in all aspects of life. The bus stop on Maple Street served 12 children from the surrounding neighborhood, representing the diversity that had attracted Keisha to this particular community. The children typically gathered by 7:20 in the morning, allowing adequate time for the 7:30 pickup that would deliver them to Lincoln Elementary by 8 o'clock. This schedule had functioned smoothly for the first 6 weeks of the school year, creating routine and reliability that working parents like Keisha depended upon. Frank Morrison had been driving school bus Route 47 for 8 years, developing a reputation among parents and school administrators that reflected both his punctuality and his increasingly problematic attitudes toward minority students. At 53 years old, Morrison represented a generation of transportation workers who had entered the profession when diversity training and cultural sensitivity requirements were minimal. His personnel file contained 3 formal complaints related to inappropriate comments about student backgrounds, all dismissed by supervisors who prioritized route reliability over addressing behavioral concerns. Morrison's approach to student discipline reflected personal biases that he had never been required to examine or modify. He maintained stricter behavioral expectations for Black and Hispanic students, interpreting normal childhood energy as disrespectful or threatening when displayed by minority children. His route management style included strategic delays at stops serving predominantly white neighborhoods, allowing additional time for conversation and assistance, while maintaining rigid schedules in areas where minority families resided. The events that would transform both the Williams family and the entire transportation system began when Morrison approached the Maple Street stop that Tuesday morning. His usual route included 43 stops serving 217 students across a 12-mile circuit that connected 4 different neighborhoods to Lincoln Elementary. The demographics of his route reflected the district's diversity, requiring professional behavior that respected all families equally. Zara and Malik stood with their classmates as Bus 47 approached the designated stop location. Both children carried backpacks containing completed homework assignments and special projects they had prepared with their mother's assistance the previous evening. Zara held her permission slip for an upcoming field trip to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, while Malik clutched his contribution to the 2nd grade Reading Buddy program. Morrison's expression hardened as he observed the group of children waiting at the stop. The presence of 4 Black students among the 12 waiting passengers triggered his established pattern of discriminatory behavior. He had developed various strategies for limiting minority student access to transportation services, including claims of overcrowding, behavioral infractions, and schedule pressures that mysteriously affected only certain demographic groups. Each usury. The bus doors opened with their characteristic hydraulic hiss, and Morrison's voice carried across the morning air with uncharacteristic harshness. "Bus is at capacity," he announced, despite the visible empty seats that lined both sides of the vehicle's interior. "These 4 will need to find alternative transportation." His finger pointed directly at Zara, Malik, and 2 other Black students who had been waiting patiently with their white classmates. The arbitrariness of his selection was immediately obvious to everyone present, creating a moment of shocked silence among children who had never witnessed such blatant discrimination in their young lives. 8-year-old Zara possessed her mother's intelligence and moral clarity, understanding immediately that Morrison's decision was based on racial prejudice rather than legitimate transportation concerns. "There are empty seats," she stated clearly, her voice carrying the confidence that Keisha had instilled through years of encouraging her daughter to speak truth to authority when faced with injustice. Morrison's response revealed the depth of his bias and the confidence he felt in exercising discriminatory authority without consequences. "Don't talk back to me, girl," he said, his tone carrying implications that extended far beyond transportation policy. You people need to learn respect and find your own way to school. The phrase, you people, landed like a physical blow among the children and the few parents who had accompanied younger students to the bus stop. Morrison's mask of professional behavior had slipped entirely, revealing the racial animosity that had influenced his treatment of minority students throughout his career with the school district. Malik, despite his young age, recognized the wrongness of Morrison's behavior and reached for his sister's hand, providing the comfort and solidarity that their mother had taught them to offer each other when facing adversity. The other black students, a brother and sister named David and Destiny Thompson, stood frozen in confusion and humiliation as their white classmates boarded the bus that would take them to school on time. The white students who witnessed Morrison's discrimination faced their own moment of moral testing. Some looked away uncomfortably, recognizing the injustice but lacking the courage or understanding to intervene. Others boarded the bus silently, accepting the benefits of their racial privilege without acknowledging the harm being inflicted on their classmates. A few attempted to speak up, only to be silenced by Morrison's aggressive warnings about interfering with transportation decisions. As Bus 47 pulled away from the Maple Street stop, Zara and Malik stood on the sidewalk with David and Destiny Thompson, facing a 3-mile walk to Lincoln Elementary that would make them late for classes and subject them to attendance penalties. The morning air carried the sounds of Morrison's laughter and the engine noise that symbolized their exclusion from educational opportunities that should have been guaranteed by federal and state law. The psychological impact of this discrimination extended far beyond transportation inconvenience. These children experienced the crushing realization that their race made them targets for adult hostility in spaces where they should have felt safe and protected. The incident challenged their developing understanding of fairness and justice, forcing them to confront racial realities that their parents had hoped to shield them from during their elementary school years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Zara's immediate response demonstrated the leadership qualities and moral courage that her mother had cultivated through years of teaching her children to stand up against injustice. She pulled out her cell phone, a device Keisha had provided for emergency situations exactly like this one, and dialed her mother's direct office number with steady hands despite her racing heart. The call connected as Keisha was reviewing morning transportation reports, completely unaware that her own children were experiencing the very discrimination she worked daily to prevent in her official capacity. The sound of Zara's voice, struggling to maintain composure while explaining Morrison's actions, triggered a transformation in Keisha that would reshape the entire educational transportation system. "Mama," Zara said, her voice carrying both hurt and determination. "The bus driver said we can't ride because the bus is full, but there are empty seats." He pointed at me and Malik and David and Destiny and said, "You people need to find our own way to school." The words hit Keisha with the force of every racial injustice she had ever experienced or witnessed. In that moment, her dual identity as a protective mother and a government official responsible for transportation equity created a perfect storm of righteous anger and professional authority. Morrison had unknowingly targeted the children of the one person in North Carolina with both the knowledge and power to hold him accountable for his discriminatory actions. Keisha's response was immediate and decisive. "Stay exactly where you are," she told her daughter while simultaneously pulling up Morrison's employment record on her computer system. "Do not attempt to walk to school. I am handling this situation right now." As she spoke, Keisha was already accessing the real-time GPS tracking system that monitored all school buses in her jurisdiction. Bus 47 appeared on her screen as a moving blue dot, currently heading toward Lincoln Elementary, with available capacity that contradicted Morrison's claims of overcrowding. The data provided irrefutable evidence of his discriminatory decision-making. The documentation process began immediately, as Keisha activated recording protocols that would preserve evidence of Morrison's violation of federal civil rights law, state transportation regulations, and school district anti-discrimination policies. Her years of experience in transportation oversight had prepared her for exactly this type of enforcement action, though she had never anticipated needing to use these tools to protect her own children. Morrison continued his route toward Lincoln Elementary, completely unaware that his career was about to end and his actions would trigger comprehensive reforms throughout the state transportation system. His confidence in facing no consequences for discriminating against black students was about to be shattered by the reality that he had targeted the wrong family on the wrong morning. The transformation that was about to unfold would demonstrate how preparation, professional excellence, and moral courage combine to create opportunities for justice when individuals with authority refuse to tolerate discrimination. Morrison's assumptions about facing no accountability were about to collide with the reality of Dr. Keisha Williams' determination to protect not only her own children, but every student who deserved equal access to educational opportunities. Dr. Keisha Williams' transformation from concerned mother to avenging professional began the moment she hung up the phone with Zara. The fusion of personal anguish and institutional authority created a formidable force that would systematically dismantle the discriminatory practices that had infected the transportation system under her jurisdiction. Her office at the Department of Transportation headquarters in Raleigh became the command center for an operation that would expose decades of unchecked bias and implement reforms that would serve as a national model for transportation equity. The immediate priority involved ensuring her children's safety and educational access, while building an irrefutable case against Frank Morrison and the institutional failures that had enabled his discriminatory behavior. Keisha's dual perspective as both a protective parent and a seasoned government administrator allowed her to pursue justice through multiple channels simultaneously, maximizing the impact of her response while maintaining the professional standards that had earned her respect throughout the state transportation system. Her first action involved activating the emergency response protocols that she had developed for addressing serious transportation incidents. These procedures included immediate supervisor notification, incident documentation requirements, and protective measures for affected students. However, this situation demanded a more comprehensive response than standard protocols could provide, requiring Keisha to leverage her full authority and expertise to ensure that Morrison faced appropriate consequences for his civil rights violations. The real-time GPS tracking system revealed that Bus 47 was proceeding normally toward Lincoln Elementary, carrying students who had been allowed to board while her children remained stranded at the Maple Street stop. The data provided precise evidence of available seating capacity that contradicted Morrison's claims of overcrowding, establishing the foundation for demonstrating that his actions were motivated by racial discrimination rather than legitimate transportation concerns. Keisha immediately contacted her deputy director, Marcus Chen, a transportation safety specialist who had worked closely with her on previous discrimination investigations. Marcus possessed the technical expertise and investigative experience necessary to coordinate the multifaceted response that this incident required. His ability to maintain objectivity while pursuing justice through established legal channels would prove essential as the case developed. The documentation process began with detailed recordings of all communications related to the incident, ensuring that every aspect of the response would be preserved for potential legal proceedings and administrative review. Keisha understood that civil rights cases required meticulous evidence collection and systematic documentation that could withstand scrutiny from defense attorneys and skeptical administrators who might question her motivations for pursuing such aggressive enforcement action. Her personal knowledge of Morrison's employment history provided critical context for understanding how this incident fit into a broader pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been overlooked or minimized by previous supervisors. The 3 formal complaints in his personnel file represented documented evidence of bias that established his propensity for treating minority students differently than their white counterparts, suggesting systematic rather than isolated misconduct. The deeper investigation revealed disturbing patterns that extended far beyond Morrison's individual actions. The Transportation Department's complaint resolution processes had consistently dismissed or minimized reports of discriminatory behavior from minority parents, creating an environment where drivers like Morrison felt confident that their biased actions would face no meaningful consequences. These institutional failures had enabled discrimination to flourish while maintaining the appearance of compliance with federal civil rights requirements. Keisha's analysis of transportation data from the previous 3 years revealed statistical disparities that supported the anecdotal reports she had received about unequal treatment of minority students. Bus routes serving predominantly white neighborhoods maintained consistently higher on-time performance rates, received priority for vehicle maintenance and replacement, and experienced fewer reported incidents of driver misconduct. These patterns suggested systematic bias in resource allocation and service delivery that violated both federal transportation equity requirements and basic principles of equal protection. The investigation expanded to include review of driver training programs, supervision protocols, and performance evaluation procedures that had failed to identify or address Morrison's discriminatory behavior. The training curriculum contained minimal content related to civil rights compliance or cultural sensitivity, focusing primarily on technical driving skills and basic safety procedures, while ignoring the interpersonal competencies necessary for serving diverse student populations effectively. Morrison's performance evaluations revealed a troubling pattern of supervisory approval for behavior that should have triggered corrective action and additional training. His route management style, characterized by rigid enforcement of rules for minority students while showing flexibility for white families, had been praised as maintaining discipline and schedule adherence. These positive assessments demonstrated how institutional bias could transform discriminatory behavior into professional virtues when evaluated by supervisors who shared similar prejudices. The broader organizational culture that had enabled Morrison's discrimination became evident through interviews with other transportation personnel and review of internal communications. Informal networks among drivers included regular exchanges of complaints about serving certain neighborhoods, discussions of strategies for managing difficult students that disproportionately targeted minority children, and reinforcement of stereotypes that justified differential treatment based on racial assumptions. Keisha's comprehensive understanding of federal transportation law and civil rights regulations provided the framework for building a case that would ensure meaningful consequences for Morrison, while addressing the systematic problems that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. The incident with her children represented a clear violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination in federally funded programs, as well as state laws that guaranteed equal access to educational transportation services. The legal strategy involved coordinating with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and state agencies responsible for enforcing anti-discrimination laws in educational settings. This multi-jurisdictional approach would ensure that Morrison faced consequences at multiple levels, while creating precedents that could prevent similar discrimination in other transportation systems across the country. Meanwhile, her children remained stranded at the Maple Street bus stop, experiencing the direct impact of Morrison's discrimination while their mother worked to ensure justice through official channels. Keisha's decision to leave them at the stop rather than providing immediate transportation reflected her strategic understanding that their presence would serve as living evidence of the ongoing violation of their civil rights and the urgent need for immediate intervention. The psychological impact on Zara and Malik was significant but manageable, given the foundation of resilience and self-worth that Keisha had built through years of preparing them for the realities of racism in America. Both children understood that their mother's work involved fighting exactly the type of discrimination they were experiencing, and their trust in her ability to address the situation provided emotional stability during this traumatic encounter with adult prejudice. Zara's maturity and leadership skills became evident as she comforted the Thompson children and organized their group to remain calm and dignified while waiting for their situation to be resolved. Her ability to maintain composure while documenting Morrison's exact words and actions demonstrated the critical thinking and advocacy skills that would serve her throughout her life when facing similar challenges. The community response to the incident began developing as other parents learned about Morrison's actions through their children's reports and social media communications. The diverse neighborhood around Maple Street included families from various racial and ethnic backgrounds who had chosen the area specifically because of its reputation for inclusivity and quality educational opportunities. Morrison's blatant discrimination challenged their assumptions about progress and equality in their community. Several white parents who witnessed the incident faced their own moment of moral reckoning as they realized their silence had enabled discrimination against their neighbors' children. Some immediately contacted school administrators to report what they had observed, while others struggled with the discomfort of acknowledging their privilege and complicity in a system that benefited their children while harming others. The documentation of witness testimony became a crucial component of the case, providing independent verification of Morrison's discriminatory language and actions. These accounts from parents and students who had no personal relationship with the Williams family strengthened the evidence base and demonstrated that the incident was witnessed by community members who could testify about Morrison's specific statements and behavior. Dr. Williams' investigation revealed that similar incidents had occurred on Morrison's route throughout the previous school year, but had not been reported through official channels due to minority parents, lack of knowledge about their rights, and the appropriate procedures for filing discrimination complaints. This pattern of unreported incidents suggested that the discrimination against her children represented a routine practice rather than an isolated outburst of prejudice. The broader implications of Morrison's behavior extended beyond individual acts of discrimination to systemic denial of educational opportunities for minority students. Late arrivals caused by transportation discrimination resulted in missed instructional time, increased absenteeism, and academic penalties that disproportionately affected students who were already facing various barriers to educational success. These cumulative impacts violated the fundamental principle that all children deserve equal access to educational opportunities regardless of their racial background. Keisha's professional network included transportation directors from other states who had successfully implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination programs in their jurisdictions. Their experiences provided valuable guidance for developing reforms that would address both individual misconduct and institutional practices that enabled discrimination to flourish within transportation systems that serve diverse student populations. The technical aspects of the investigation required analysis of radio communications, GPS tracking data, and video surveillance from bus-mounted cameras that could provide objective evidence of Morrison's actions and the actual capacity conditions on his vehicle. These technological resources offered unprecedented opportunities to document discrimination with precision that would be difficult for defense attorneys to challenge during potential legal proceedings. The morning progressed with increasing momentum, as various components of the investigation began generating evidence that supported comprehensive action against Morrison and the systematic problems that had enabled his behavior. The real-time nature of the incident provided unique opportunities to gather evidence while the discrimination was ongoing, creating stronger legal foundations than cases that relied primarily on after-the-fact testimony and reconstruction. Morrison remained completely unaware that his career was ending, and his actions were triggering the most comprehensive civil rights investigation in the state transportation department's history. His confidence in avoiding consequences reflected years of experience with an institutional culture that had tolerated and even rewarded discriminatory behavior when it was directed toward minority students and families who lacked the knowledge and resources necessary to challenge such treatment effectively. The convergence of Morrison's discriminatory actions with Dr. Williams' unique combination of personal motivation and professional authority created perfect conditions for achieving justice that had been denied to previous victims of transportation discrimination. Her children's traumatic experience would be transformed into an opportunity for systematic reform that would benefit countless other students who deserved equal access to educational opportunities. The investigation was building toward a confrontation that would expose not only Morrison's individual prejudice, but also the institutional failures that had allowed such discrimination to flourish within a system that was supposed to serve all children equally. The morning that had begun with Morrison's confident assertion of his authority to exclude black children from transportation services was about to become a defining moment in the struggle for educational equity and civil rights enforcement. The comprehensive investigation drive Keisha Williams initiated within the first hour of Morrison's discriminatory actions revealed systematic violations that extended far beyond a single bus driver's prejudiced behavior. Her access to state transportation databases, federal compliance records, and inter-district communication systems provided unprecedented insight into patterns of discrimination that had operated with impunity for years. The evidence emerging from multiple data sources painted a disturbing picture of institutional failure that had betrayed the fundamental promise of equal educational access for all children. The database analysis revealed that Morrison's route had experienced the highest rate of minority student complaints in the entire district over the previous 3 academic years, yet supervisory reviews had consistently rated his performance as satisfactory or above average. This disconnect between documented complaints and official evaluations demonstrated either gross incompetence or deliberate indifference among transportation administrators who were responsible for ensuring equitable service delivery to all students regardless of racial background. Dr. Williams discovered that complaint resolution procedures had been systematically manipulated to minimize the appearance of discrimination-related issues while protecting drivers who exhibited clear patterns of biased behavior. Formal complaints from minority parents were frequently reclassified as general service concerns or dismissed entirely due to alleged lack of sufficient evidence, even when multiple witnesses corroborated incidents of discriminatory treatment. This administrative sleight of hand had allowed the Transportation Department to maintain a facade of compliance with civil rights requirements while perpetuating the very discrimination that federal laws were designed to prevent. The GPS tracking data revealed additional evidence of systematic bias in route management that violated both federal regulations and basic principles of service equity. Morrison's bus consistently spent additional time at stops in predominantly white neighborhoods, allowing for extended conversations and assistance with student boarding, while maintaining rigid adherence to schedule constraints in areas where minority families resided. These timing discrepancies created a two-tiered system of service that provided superior transportation experiences for white students, while treating minority children as burdens to be managed efficiently, rather than valued passengers deserving respectful service. The video surveillance system that monitored school bus interiors had captured numerous incidents of Morrison's discriminatory behavior toward minority students over the previous semester. The recorded evidence showed him applying stricter behavioral standards to Black and Hispanic children, using harsher disciplinary language, and demonstrating clear favoritism toward white students who exhibited identical behaviors. These recordings provided irrefutable documentation of the discriminatory treatment that had previously relied on conflicting testimony between drivers and students. Dr. Williams' analysis of the video evidence revealed sophisticated patterns of psychological intimidation that Morrison employed to discourage minority students from reporting his misconduct. His methods included subtle threats about potential consequences for complaining, suggestions that their parents lacked sufficient credibility to challenge his authority, and strategic humiliation designed to reinforce feelings of powerlessness among children who are already navigating various social and economic challenges in their daily lives. The investigation expanded to include examination of hiring practices, training programs, and performance evaluation procedures that had created an organizational culture where discrimination could flourish without detection or accountability. The Transportation Department's recruitment efforts had consistently failed to attract diverse candidates for driver positions, resulting in a workforce that was overwhelmingly white and largely disconnected from the communities they served. This demographic homogeneity had contributed to an insular culture where discriminatory attitudes went unchallenged and were often reinforced through informal social interactions among employees. The training curriculum analysis revealed minimal attention to civil rights compliance, cultural competency, or appropriate methods for serving diverse student populations. New drivers received extensive instruction on technical vehicle operation and basic safety procedures, but virtually no preparation for the interpersonal challenges of working with children from different racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. This training gap had left drivers like Morrison to rely on personal biases and cultural assumptions when making decisions about student discipline and service delivery. Dr. Williams discovered that Morrison's discriminatory behavior had been enabled by a supervision system that prioritized operational efficiency over service equity. Route supervisors evaluated driver performance based primarily on schedule adherence, mechanical compliance, and absence of serious safety incidents, while paying minimal attention to the quality of interactions between drivers and minority students. This narrow focus on quantifiable metrics had created blind spots that allowed discrimination to operate beneath the radar of official oversight mechanisms. The complaint resolution process revealed additional evidence of institutional bias that had protected Morrison and other drivers who exhibited similar patterns of discriminatory behavior. Parent complaints about driver conduct were routinely forwarded to the same supervisors who had hired and evaluated the accused drivers, creating obvious conflicts of interest that undermined objective investigation and resolution. Furthermore, the complaint forms and procedures were available only in English, effectively excluding non-English-speaking families from accessing formal channels for addressing discrimination. The broader investigation revealed that Morrison's actions represented part of a systematic effort to discourage minority families from utilizing transportation services through various forms of harassment and differential treatment. These tactics included arbitrary enforcement of dress codes, selective application of behavioral standards, strategic delays that caused students to miss important academic activities, and creation of hostile environments that made bus rides traumatic experiences rather than routine transportation services. Dr. Williams' professional network provided access to comparative data from other state transportation systems that had successfully implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination programs. These examples demonstrated that the problems plaguing her jurisdiction were neither inevitable nor technically difficult to address through appropriate policy changes, training improvements, and accountability mechanisms. The persistence of discriminatory practices in North Carolina reflected institutional choices rather than insurmountable challenges. The Federal Compliance Review revealed that the State Transportation Department had been operating in violation of Title VI requirements for several years while submitting false reports that claimed full compliance with civil rights obligations. These fraudulent submissions had enabled the department to continue receiving federal funding while systematically denying equal services to minority students. The documentation of this compliance fraud provided additional legal foundations for comprehensive enforcement action. Dr. Williams' investigation uncovered evidence that Morrison had been coaching other drivers on methods for discriminating against minority students while avoiding formal complaints or administrative scrutiny. These informal mentoring relationships had spread discriminatory practices throughout the transportation system, creating networks of bias that reinforced and normalized prejudiced treatment of children based on racial characteristics. The analysis of attendance data revealed that transportation discrimination had measurable impacts on educational outcomes for minority students who experienced irregular or hostile service. Students subjected to Morrison's discriminatory treatment showed higher rates of tardiness, increased absenteeism, and declining academic performance that correlated with their transportation experiences. These educational harms demonstrated that transportation discrimination created lasting damage that extended far beyond temporary inconvenience. The investigation revealed that Morrison's confidence in avoiding consequences for his discriminatory behavior was based on accurate assessment of the institutional protection he had received throughout his career. Previous complaints about his conduct had been dismissed, minimized, or ignored by supervisors who shared his biased attitudes or lacked the competence and commitment necessary to enforce civil rights requirements effectively. Dr. Williams discovered that the Transportation Department had been receiving complaints about discriminatory service delivery for over a decade, but had never conducted comprehensive investigations or implemented systematic reforms to address the underlying problems. This pattern of inaction had created an environment where drivers understood that discriminatory behavior would be tolerated as long as it remained below the threshold of public scandal or media attention. The evidence accumulated through multiple investigative channels created an overwhelming case for comprehensive intervention that would address both Morrison's individual misconduct and the institutional failures that had enabled systematic discrimination. Dr. Williams possessed the legal authority, technical expertise, and documented evidence necessary to pursue consequences through multiple enforcement mechanisms simultaneously. The real-time nature of the investigation provided unique opportunities to demonstrate ongoing discrimination while building comprehensive cases for both individual accountability and systematic reform. Morrison's actions against her children had triggered the most thorough civil rights investigation in the state transportation department's history, with potential consequences that would reshape service delivery throughout North Carolina. Meanwhile, her children remained at the Maple Street bus stop, serving as living evidence of the ongoing violation of their constitutional rights, while their mother assembled the evidence necessary to ensure that justice would be both swift and comprehensive. The documentation process was creating an irrefutable record of discrimination that would survive any legal challenges, while establishing precedents for protecting other minority students from similar treatment. The investigation was building toward a confrontation that would expose the full scope of institutional failure while demonstrating how professional competence combined with moral authority could achieve justice that had been denied to previous victims of transportation discrimination. Morrison's assumption that he could discriminate against black children without consequences was about to collide with the reality of Dr. Williams' determination to use every available legal and administrative tool to protect her children and transform the system that had failed them. The convergence of overwhelming evidence, legal authority, and personal motivation created perfect conditions for achieving meaningful change that would extend far beyond addressing Morrison's individual prejudice to comprehensive reform of transportation policies and practices throughout the state system. Dr. Keisha Williams arrived at Lincoln Elementary School at precisely 9:15 a.m., driving her official Department of Transportation vehicle equipped with emergency lights and state government identification markings. Her decision to respond personally to Morrison's discriminatory actions represented more than maternal protection. It demonstrated the power of institutional authority wielded by someone who possessed both the moral clarity and professional competence necessary to ensure immediate accountability for civil rights violations. The school's main office buzzed with the controlled chaos typical of elementary administration, with secretaries managing phone calls from concerned parents while coordinating the daily logistics of educating over 400 students. Principal Sandra Martinez looked up from her desk as Dr. Williams entered, her professional bearing and government credentials immediately commanding the respectful attention that her position warranted within the educational hierarchy. Principal Martinez recognized Dr. Williams from previous interactions during transportation safety meetings but had never seen her in the context of addressing discrimination complaints involving her own children. The convergence of personal and professional authority in a single individual created an unprecedented situation that would test the school's commitment to supporting families who faced racial discrimination while utilizing district transportation services. Dr. Williams presented her identification and stated her purpose with the clarity and precision that characterized her approach to all professional communications. She explained that Frank Morrison had denied transportation services to her children and 3 other minority students based explicitly on racial discrimination, and that her investigation had revealed systematic violations of federal civil rights law that required immediate intervention and comprehensive remediation. The principal's initial response reflected the institutional discomfort that often emerged when discrimination complaints required acknowledgement of systematic failures rather than isolated incidents. Principal Martinez expressed concern about the allegations, while suggesting that misunderstandings between drivers and students sometimes occurred during stressful morning routines, particularly when buses experienced capacity constraints or schedule pressures that complicated service delivery. Dr. Williams interrupted this deflection with evidence that eliminated any possibility of characterizing Morrison's actions as misunderstandings or operational difficulties. She presented video footage from Bus 47's interior surveillance system that clearly showed available seating while Morrison claimed overcrowding, audio recordings of his discriminatory language targeting minority students, and GPS data demonstrating that his route management consistently favored white neighborhoods while penalizing areas with predominantly minority populations. The weight of this documented evidence shifted the conversation from damage control to crisis management, as Principal Martinez realized that her school was implicated in a federal civil rights violation that could result in loss of funding, administrative sanctions, and negative publicity that would damage the district's reputation within the community. The systematic nature of the discrimination indicated institutional responsibility rather than individual misconduct that could be addressed through limited disciplinary action. Dr. Williams explained that her authority as Regional Transportation Safety Director included oversight of all school bus operations within 6 counties, encompassing Lincoln Elementary's district, and establishing her jurisdiction to investigate and remediate the discrimination her children had experienced. This revelation transformed the dynamic from a parent complaint to an official government investigation with potential consequences that extended throughout the entire transportation system. The discussion expanded to include Transportation Supervisor James Conway, who had been summoned to address the allegations against Morrison and explain how such systematic discrimination had operated without detection through established oversight mechanisms. Conway's arrival created additional tension as he attempted to defend Morrison's record while simultaneously acknowledging the seriousness of documented civil rights violations. Conway's initial response demonstrated the institutional bias that had enabled Morrison's discriminatory behavior to continue unchecked for years. He characterized Morrison as a dedicated driver who maintained discipline and schedule adherence while serving challenging routes that included diverse student populations with varying behavioral expectations. This defense revealed the coded language that transportation administrators used to justify differential treatment of minority students while maintaining plausible deniability about discriminatory intent. Dr. Williams systematically dismantled Conway's deflections by presenting comprehensive evidence of Morrison's pattern of discriminatory behavior, including statistical analysis of complaint patterns, comparative timing data from different neighborhood stops, and witness testimony from parents and students who had observed biased treatment over multiple academic years. The accumulation of evidence eliminated any possibility of characterizing the current incident as isolated misconduct rather than systematic discrimination. The confrontation intensified when Conway suggested that Dr. Williams' personal involvement might compromise her objectivity in evaluating allegations against district transportation personnel. This challenge to her professional competence represented the type of institutional resistance that minority officials often faced when pursuing civil rights enforcement that threatened established practices and informal power structures within predominantly white organizations. Dr. Williams' response demonstrated both her technical expertise and her understanding of how institutional bias operated to protect discriminatory practices from accountability. She explained that federal law required immediate intervention when civil rights violations were documented, regardless of the personal connections between investigating officials and affected families. Her authority derived from legal mandates rather than personal grievances, establishing clear foundations for enforcement action. The legal framework she outlined included Title VI compliance requirements, Section 504 obligations for ensuring equal access to educational services, and state transportation regulations that mandated non-discriminatory service delivery to all qualified students. These multiple legal authorities provided overlapping foundations for enforcement action that could not be dismissed through administrative maneuvering or procedural delays. Principal Martinez requested clarification about the immediate steps necessary to address the discrimination while protecting the school from potential sanctions or funding disruptions. Her pragmatic approach reflected recognition that institutional interests required cooperation with Dr. Williams, investigation rather than resistance that could escalate consequences for the district and individual administrators. Dr. Williams outlined a comprehensive response plan that included immediate suspension of Morrison pending investigation completion, emergency transportation arrangements for affected students, mandatory retraining for all transportation personnel, and implementation of enhanced oversight mechanisms to prevent future discrimination. These requirements represented minimum acceptable remediation rather than negotiable suggestions for voluntary improvement. The immediate priority involved ensuring that Zara, Malik, and the Thompson children received transportation to school without further delay or potential retaliation from Morrison or other drivers who might resent the accountability measures being implemented. Dr. Williams arranged for a substitute driver to collect the stranded students while maintaining documentation of the time they had missed from their educational activities due to Morrison's discriminatory actions. Conway's resistance to immediate suspension of Morrison revealed the depth of institutional protection that had enabled systematic discrimination to operate with impunity. He argued that suspension without completed investigation could violate Morrison's employment rights and create precedents that might encourage frivolous complaints against other drivers who maintained appropriate discipline in challenging circumstances. Dr. Williams countered this argument by emphasizing that civil rights violations created immediate liability for the district and required prompt action to prevent continuing harm to affected students. The documented evidence eliminated any reasonable doubt about Morrison's discriminatory behavior, making immediate suspension a protective measure for both students and the district, rather than premature punishment of potentially innocent personnel. The discussion revealed fundamental differences in understanding about institutional responsibility for addressing discrimination. Conway and Principal Martinez approached the situation as an isolated personnel issue, requiring careful investigation and measured response, while Dr. Williams recognized it as evidence of systematic failures that demanded comprehensive reform and immediate protective action. The power dynamics shifted decisively when Dr. Williams explained that her investigation had already generated sufficient evidence for federal enforcement action through multiple agencies, including the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, and state agencies responsible for transportation oversight. This multi-jurisdictional approach would ensure that consequences extended beyond local administrative action to include potential criminal prosecution and federal oversight. Conway's demeanor changed noticeably as he realized that Morrison's actions had exposed the Transportation Department to federal investigation that could reveal additional violations throughout the system. The comprehensive nature of Dr. Williams' evidence collection suggested that her investigation would examine practices and policies across multiple routes and personnel, potentially implicating supervisors who had enabled or ignored discriminatory behavior. The meeting concluded with agreement on immediate implementation of Dr. Williams' remediation requirements, including Morrison's suspension, emergency transportation arrangements, and initiation of comprehensive policy review to address systematic discrimination throughout the district. Principal Martinez committed to full cooperation with the investigation, while emphasizing her school's dedication to ensuring equal treatment for all students regardless of racial background. Dr. Williams departed Lincoln Elementary with established protocols for protecting her children and other minority students from continued discrimination, while pursuing comprehensive accountability for the institutional failures that had enabled Morrison's behavior. Her professional authority had transformed a discriminatory incident into an opportunity for systematic reform that would benefit countless students throughout the transportation system. The confrontation demonstrated how preparation, expertise, and moral courage could achieve immediate results, when individuals with appropriate authority refused to tolerate discrimination. Morrison's confidence in avoiding consequences had been shattered by the reality that he had targeted the children of someone who possessed both the knowledge and power to ensure accountability through multiple enforcement mechanisms. The morning that had begun with Morrison's discriminatory exclusion of minority students from transportation services had been transformed into a catalyst for comprehensive reform that would reshape policies and practices throughout the state transportation system. Dr. Williams' dual role as protective mother and government official had created unique opportunities for achieving justice that extended far beyond addressing individual misconduct to systematic change. Frank Morrison received the suspension notification at 10:47 a.m. while completing his morning route, completely unaware that his discriminatory actions had triggered the most comprehensive civil rights investigation in North Carolina's Transportation Department history. The radio transmission from dispatch supervisor Janet Reynolds carried an unusual urgency that immediately distinguished this communication from routine operational updates or schedule modifications that drivers typically receive during active route operations. The message was brief but devastating in its implications for Morrison's career and future employment prospects within the transportation industry. Dispatch instructed him to return immediately to the district transportation facility, transfer his vehicle to a replacement driver, and report to Administrative Supervisor Conway for immediate consultation regarding serious allegations that had been filed against his professional conduct during morning service delivery. Morrison's initial reaction reflected the confidence he had developed through years of discriminatory behavior that had faced no meaningful consequences from supervisors who either shared his biased attitudes or lacked the competence necessary to recognize and address systematic civil rights violations. His assumption that minority parents lacked sufficient knowledge, resources, or credibility to challenge his authority had been reinforced through decades of institutional protection that insulated transportation personnel from accountability for discriminatory practices. The drive back to the transportation facility provided Morrison with time to consider potential explanations for the unusual summons, while maintaining his conviction that any complaints from minority families would be dismissed or minimized through the administrative processes that had consistently protected him throughout his career. His experience suggested that transportation supervisors prioritized operational efficiency and driver retention over addressing discrimination complaints that required complex investigations and potential personnel changes. Morrison's arrival at the district transportation facility revealed an unprecedented level of administrative activity that suggested his situation involved more serious consequences than routine complaint resolution procedures typically produced. Multiple supervisory vehicles occupied spaces normally reserved for routine maintenance activities, while personnel who rarely visited the facility during operational hours gathered in conference rooms that were typically used only for monthly safety meetings or annual performance evaluations. Administrative Supervisor Conway greeted Morrison with professional courtesy that masked the institutional crisis his discriminatory actions had created for the Transportation Department and individual administrators who had enabled systematic bias through inadequate oversight and accountability mechanisms. Conway understood that Morrison's case would likely result in federal investigation that could expose additional violations throughout the system, while generating negative publicity that would damage the district's reputation within the community. The initial discussion between Conway and Morrison revealed the depth of institutional dysfunction that had enabled discriminatory practices to operate without detection through established oversight mechanisms. Conway's approach to addressing the allegations reflected years of experience with minimizing discrimination complaints while protecting drivers from consequences that could disrupt operational efficiency or create precedents for accountability that might encourage additional complaints from minority families. Morrison's defense of his actions demonstrated both his confidence in avoiding meaningful consequences and his fundamental misunderstanding of the legal and professional standards that govern transportation service delivery to diverse student populations. He characterized his decision to exclude minority students as appropriate capacity management that prioritized safety and schedule adherence over accommodating families who failed to understand the operational constraints that drivers faced during challenging morning routes. The conversation shifted dramatically when Conway revealed that the complaint had been filed by Dr. Keisha Williams, Regional Transportation Safety Director for the North Carolina Department of Transportation, whose children had been among the students Morrison had excluded from transportation services based on racial discrimination. This information fundamentally altered Morrison's understanding of his situation, and the potential consequences he would face for behavior that he had assumed would remain invisible to authorities with actual power to impose accountability. Conway explained that Dr. Williams possessed comprehensive authority over transportation operations throughout the region, including oversight of employment practices, training programs, safety protocols, and civil rights compliance that directly affected Morrison's continued employment and professional credentials. Her investigation had already generated sufficient evidence to support immediate suspension and potential termination while establishing foundations for federal enforcement action that could result in criminal prosecution. Morrison's reaction to this revelation demonstrated the shock that individuals experience when their assumptions about institutional protection prove unfounded. His years of confident discrimination had been based on accurate assessment of local administrative dysfunction, but he had failed to anticipate that his actions might affect families with direct access to higher levels of authority within the transportation oversight system. The evidence presentation that followed eliminated any possibility of characterizing Morrison's actions as misunderstandings or operational decisions rather than deliberate discrimination based on racial prejudice. Conway shared video surveillance footage that clearly documented Morrison's exclusion of minority students despite available seating capacity, audio recordings of his discriminatory language, and comparative data showing systematic bias in his treatment of different student populations over multiple academic years. The comprehensiveness of Dr. Williams' investigation revealed sophisticated understanding of both legal requirements and institutional processes that would ensure meaningful consequences for Morrison's discriminatory behavior. Her documentation included federal civil rights violations, state transportation regulation breaches, and employment policy infractions that provided multiple foundations for disciplinary action that could not be appealed or overturned through administrative maneuvering. Morrison's attempts to justify his actions through claims about student behavior, capacity constraints, or operational pressures were systematically refuted through objective evidence that demonstrated the discriminatory nature of his decision-making processes. The video footage showed him applying different behavioral standards to minority and white students, while GPS data revealed timing patterns that favored predominantly white neighborhoods at the expense of areas with minority populations. The discussion expanded to include Morrison's broader employment history and the pattern of complaints that had been dismissed or minimized by previous supervisors who failed to recognize or address the systematic discrimination that violated federal law and basic principles of equal service delivery. Conway acknowledged that administrative failures had enabled Morrison's behavior while emphasizing that current allegations required immediate action to prevent continuing civil rights violations. Morrison's suspension included immediate surrender of his commercial driving credentials, removal from all transportation-related duties, and prohibition from contact with students or parents while the investigation proceeded toward completion. These measures reflected both the seriousness of documented violations and the institutional vulnerability that his actions had created for the district and individual administrators who had failed to prevent discriminatory practices. The broader implications of Morrison's case extended throughout the transportation department as administrators realized that Dr. Williams' investigation would likely examine systematic problems that affected multiple routes, drivers, and supervisory personnel. The comprehensive nature of her evidence collection suggested expertise and authority that could identify additional violations while implementing reforms that would fundamentally alter how transportation services were delivered to diverse student populations. The personnel changes required to address Morrison's discriminatory behavior included immediate implementation of substitute driver arrangements for his route, emergency retraining programs for existing transportation staff, and enhanced oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future discrimination. These operational adjustments demonstrated institutional commitment to compliance while acknowledging the systematic failures that had enabled Morrison's behavior to continue unchecked. Dr. Williams' authority to mandate comprehensive reforms reflected her position within the state transportation hierarchy and her expertise in civil rights compliance that exceeded the knowledge and capabilities of local district administrators. Her requirements included policy revisions, training enhancements, supervision improvements, and accountability mechanisms that would transform how discrimination complaints were investigated and resolved throughout the system. The immediate response to Morrison's suspension created ripple effects throughout the transportation department, as other drivers recognized that their own discriminatory practices might face similar scrutiny under enhanced oversight procedures. The message was clear that institutional protection for biased behavior had ended, and that future discrimination would result in swift and comprehensive consequences for individual personnel and supervisory administrators. Meanwhile, Dr. Williams had arranged for emergency transportation to collect her children and the Thompson siblings from the Maple Street bus stop, ensuring that their educational activities could proceed without further disruption, while maintaining documentation of the time they had lost due to Morrison's discriminatory actions. The substitute driver who provided this service represented the type of professional, respectful transportation that all students deserved regardless of their racial background. The transformation that Morrison's discriminatory actions had triggered extended beyond individual accountability to systematic reform that would benefit countless minority students who had previously faced discrimination without recourse through established complaint resolution procedures. Dr. Williams' unique combination of personal motivation and professional authority had created unprecedented opportunities for achieving comprehensive change. The morning that had begun with Morrison's confident assertion of his authority to exclude minority children from transportation services had evolved into a catalyst for institutional transformation that would reshape policies and practices throughout the state transportation system. His assumptions about avoiding consequences for discriminatory behavior had collided with the reality of accountability imposed by someone who possessed both the knowledge and power to ensure meaningful reform. The convergence of documented evidence, legal authority, and moral determination had created perfect conditions for achieving justice that extended far beyond addressing individual misconduct to comprehensive institutional change that would protect future generations of minority students from the discrimination that Morrison and others had perpetrated with impunity. The emergency transportation reforms Dr. Keisha Williams implemented within 48 hours of Morrison's suspension demonstrated how strategic authority combined with comprehensive planning could produce immediate systematic change that protected vulnerable students while establishing foundations for long-term institutional transformation. Her ability to leverage multiple regulatory frameworks simultaneously created enforcement mechanisms that transcended traditional administrative boundaries and eliminated opportunities for discriminatory practices to continue operating through bureaucratic delays or procedural maneuvering. The substitute driver program that replaced Morrison and 6 other drivers whose employment records revealed similar patterns of discriminatory behavior established new standards for professional conduct that emphasized respectful service delivery to all students regardless of racial background. These personnel changes required coordination with the State Transportation Licensing Authority, driver training institutes, and federal oversight agencies that monitored civil rights compliance and educational transportation services. Dr. Williams' comprehensive approach to addressing systematic discrimination included implementation of real-time monitoring systems that tracked service delivery patterns across all routes, while identifying potential bias through statistical analysis of timing data, complaint frequencies, and demographic correlations that previous oversight mechanisms had failed to detect. These technological enhancements provided objective evidence of service quality that eliminated subjective interpretations that had previously protected discriminatory practices from accountability. The training program revisions that Dr. Williams mandated included mandatory civil rights education for all transportation personnel, enhanced cultural competency requirements for driver certification, and ongoing professional development that emphasized the legal and ethical obligations of public servants who provided educational support services to diverse communities. These educational components addressed the knowledge gaps that had contributed to institutional tolerance for discriminatory behavior. The community response to Morrison's suspension and the broader reforms being implemented revealed both support for accountability measures and resistance from individuals who benefited from discriminatory practices that provided superior services to white families while penalizing minority students. The polarized reactions demonstrated how transportation equity challenged existing privilege structures that many community members had accepted as natural rather than systematically constructed advantages. Several white parents expressed concern that enhanced oversight and anti-discrimination measures might reduce service quality for their children by requiring drivers to spend equal time and attention on students from all neighborhoods regardless of demographic characteristics. These complaints revealed the extent to which discriminatory practices had become normalized within community expectations about appropriate transportation service delivery. Conversely, minority families who had previously accepted inferior service as inevitable began documenting their experiences and filing formal complaints through the enhanced reporting mechanisms that Dr. Williams had established as part of her comprehensive reform initiative. The increased complaint volume demonstrated how systematic discrimination had operated beneath the surface of official recognition, while affecting numerous families who lacked knowledge about their rights or access to effective advocacy resources. The federal agencies that Dr. Williams had engaged to support her investigation began conducting independent reviews of transportation practices throughout North Carolina and neighboring states to determine whether similar discrimination patterns existed in other jurisdictions. These expanded investigations revealed that the problems in her region represented part of a national pattern of transportation discrimination that violated federal civil rights requirements across multiple states. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division assigned a specialized team to conduct comprehensive analysis of transportation equity issues in educational settings, using Dr. Williams' documentation as a model for identifying systematic violations that traditional oversight mechanisms had failed to detect. This federal attention created additional accountability pressures while providing resources for implementing reform initiatives that exceeded what individual states could accomplish independently. The documentation standards that Dr. Williams established for investigating discrimination complaints included video evidence requirements, statistical analysis protocols, and witness interview procedures that eliminated ambiguity about whether reported incidents reflected systematic bias or isolated misunderstandings. These enhanced investigative capabilities ensured that future discrimination complaints would receive thorough examination while protecting both students and transportation personnel from false allegations. The policy revisions that emerged from Dr. Williams' investigation addressed fundamental structural problems that had enabled discrimination to flourish within transportation systems that served diverse student populations. The new regulations included specific timing requirements for route stops, behavioral management protocols that applied equally to all students, and accountability mechanisms that tracked service delivery quality across demographic groups. The supervision enhancements that Dr. Williams implemented included mandatory ride-along observations for all drivers serving diverse routes, regular review of video surveillance footage to identify potential bias in student interactions, and performance evaluation criteria that explicitly measured compliance with civil rights requirements rather than focusing exclusively on operational efficiency metrics that had previously dominated personnel assessments. The impact assessment data that began emerging within the first month of implementation revealed measurable improvements in transportation experiences for minority students who had previously faced discrimination through various forms of differential treatment. Attendance rates increased in neighborhoods that had experienced unreliable service, while disciplinary incidents on buses decreased as drivers adopted more consistent and respectful approaches to student management. The Thompson family, whose children had been stranded alongside Zara and Malik Williams, became active advocates for continued reform implementation, while sharing their experiences with other minority parents who had accepted discriminatory treatment as inevitable rather than challengeable through official channels. Their testimony provided additional evidence of systematic problems, while demonstrating how individual acts of courage could inspire broader community mobilization for civil rights enforcement. David and Destiny Thompson, the siblings who had witnessed Morrison's discrimination firsthand, developed increased confidence in advocating for fair treatment, while understanding their rights as students who deserved equal access to educational opportunities regardless of racial background. Their parents, Marcus and Angela Thompson, began participating in community oversight activities that monitored transportation service delivery while supporting other families who encountered discriminatory practices. The educational impact of improved transportation services extended beyond simple convenience to fundamental questions of academic equity and student engagement that affected long-term educational outcomes for minority children. Reliable, respectful transportation enabled consistent school attendance while reducing stress and anxiety that had previously interfered with learning when students faced hostile or unpredictable service delivery. Dr. Williams' professional reputation within the State Transportation Administration was enhanced by her successful handling of the discrimination crisis, while implementing comprehensive reforms that exceeded federal compliance requirements and established North Carolina as a national model for transportation equity in educational settings. Her expertise in civil rights enforcement combined with operational knowledge created unique qualifications for addressing similar challenges in other jurisdictions. The legislative attention that Dr. Williams' investigation generated included proposals for enhanced funding for transportation equity programs, mandatory bias training for all educational support personnel, and stronger accountability mechanisms for addressing discrimination complaints in public services that affected student access to educational opportunities. These policy initiatives reflected recognition that transportation discrimination represented a systematic problem requiring comprehensive solutions rather than isolated interventions. The media coverage of Morrison's suspension and the broader reforms being implemented attracted national attention to transportation discrimination as a civil rights issue that affected educational equity throughout the country. The documentation that Dr. Williams had assembled provided concrete evidence of how systematic bias operated within public services while demonstrating effective approaches for achieving accountability and institutional change. The professional development opportunities that emerged from Dr. Williams' successful civil rights enforcement included speaking engagements at national conferences, consulting arrangements with other states seeking to address transportation discrimination, and collaboration with federal agencies developing enhanced oversight protocols for educational equity compliance. These activities expanded her influence while spreading reform innovations to jurisdictions that faced similar challenges. The institutional culture changes that resulted from comprehensive accountability measures included increased awareness among transportation personnel about civil rights obligations, improved communication between drivers and minority families, and enhanced sensitivity to how transportation experiences affected student educational outcomes. These cultural shifts created sustainable foundations for continued equity improvements beyond the immediate reforms. The data collection systems that Dr. Williams implemented provided ongoing monitoring capabilities that would identify emerging discrimination patterns while preventing systematic bias from reestablishing itself through informal practices that operated beneath official oversight mechanisms. These technological tools created permanent accountability structures that would protect future generations of minority students from transportation discrimination. The collaboration networks that developed during the investigation included partnerships with civil rights organizations, educational advocacy groups, and community organizations that possessed expertise in addressing systematic discrimination through coordinated legal and political action. These alliances created sustained support for reform implementation while building capacity for addressing future civil rights challenges. The precedent established by Dr. Williams' comprehensive response to Morrison's discrimination demonstrated how individual acts of professional courage could trigger systematic change that benefited entire communities, while establishing legal and administrative frameworks that protected vulnerable populations from institutional bias. Her success proved that preparation, expertise, and moral determination could overcome entrenched discrimination when deployed through appropriate channels with sufficient authority to ensure meaningful accountability. The anonymous complaint filed against Drive Keisha Williams with the North Carolina Department of Transportation's Office of Professional Conduct arrived 6 weeks after Morrison's suspension, alleging that she had abused her official authority to pursue personal vendettas against transportation personnel who followed established procedures for managing difficult student behavior. The formal allegations claimed that her investigation exceeded appropriate scope while creating hostile work environments for drivers who maintained appropriate discipline standards in challenging operational circumstances. The complaint represented a sophisticated attempt to undermine Dr. Williams' credibility while casting doubt on the legitimacy of her civil rights enforcement activities. The document contained detailed references to transportation regulations and employment procedures that suggested authorship by individuals with comprehensive knowledge of administrative processes and legal requirements that governed personnel investigations within state agencies. The timing and content indicated coordinated resistance from institutional actors who possessed significant influence within the transportation bureaucracy. Dr. Williams recognized immediately that this challenge represented more than routine administrative friction following controversial personnel decisions. The complaint's technical sophistication and strategic positioning suggested involvement by experienced administrators who understood how to weaponize bureaucratic procedures against officials who threatened established practices and informal power structures that had protected discriminatory behavior from accountability measures. The allegations included claims that Dr. Williams had exceeded her jurisdictional authority by investigating local district transportation practices that fell outside regional oversight responsibilities, violated due process requirements by implementing emergency suspension procedures without adequate investigation, and created discriminatory enforcement patterns by applying enhanced scrutiny to transportation personnel who served predominantly minority student populations. These accusations represented carefully constructed inversions of civil rights principles that attempted to transform discrimination victims into perpetrators, while portraying biased transportation personnel as targets of reverse discrimination. The strategy reflected sophisticated understanding of how institutional resistance could exploit procedural complexities to undermine substantive reform efforts through administrative delays and jurisdictional disputes. The investigation that the Office of Professional Conduct initiated in response to the anonymous complaint required Dr. Williams to defend her actions while continuing to implement comprehensive reforms that address systematic transportation discrimination throughout her jurisdiction. The dual demands created significant stress while testing her ability to maintain focus on civil rights enforcement objectives despite facing potential disciplinary action that could damage her career and undermine future advocacy efforts. The administrative hearing process that accompanied the investigation revealed the depth of institutional resistance to transportation equity measures that challenged established practices and informal arrangements between supervisory personnel and drivers who had operated with minimal oversight for decades. The hearing officer assigned to evaluate the complaint possessed limited experience with civil rights cases, while demonstrating apparent sympathy for arguments that emphasized procedural concerns over substantive discrimination issues. Dr. Williams' response to the allegations required comprehensive documentation of her legal authority to investigate transportation discrimination, while establishing that her actions followed appropriate procedures for addressing civil rights violations that demanded immediate intervention to prevent continuing harm to affected students. Her defense included detailed analysis of federal regulations, state transportation codes, and established precedents for emergency action in discrimination cases. The evidence presentation that Dr. Williams assembled for her defense included video surveillance footage that clearly documented Morrison's discriminatory behavior, statistical analysis that revealed systematic bias in transportation service delivery, and testimony from affected families who had experienced discrimination without recourse through traditional complaint resolution procedures. This comprehensive documentation demonstrated that her investigation addressed legitimate civil rights violations rather than pursuing personal grievances through inappropriate administrative channels. The legal representation that Dr. Williams retained included specialists in civil rights law and administrative procedure who possessed extensive experience defending government officials who faced retaliation for enforcing anti-discrimination requirements in resistant institutional environments. Their expertise proved essential for navigating complex procedural requirements while maintaining focus on substantive issues that had motivated her original investigation. The community support that emerged during the administrative hearing process included testimony from minority parents who had benefited from transportation improvements following Morrison's suspension, advocacy organizations that recognized the national significance of her civil rights enforcement efforts, and professional colleagues who vouched for her competence and integrity as a transportation safety official who consistently followed appropriate procedures. The media attention that the administrative hearing generated revealed public interest in transportation discrimination as a civil rights issue, while exposing the institutional resistance that Dr. Williams faced for implementing accountability measures that protected minority students from discriminatory treatment. The coverage demonstrated how administrative procedures could be manipulated to discourage civil rights enforcement through personal attacks on officials who challenged systematic bias. The federal agency involvement that Dr. Williams had cultivated during her original investigation provided crucial support during the administrative hearing process. Representatives from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights testified about the legitimacy of her enforcement actions, while confirming that her investigation had followed appropriate procedures for addressing systematic discrimination in educational transportation services. The procedural challenges that emerged during the hearing process included attempts to limit the scope of evidence that Dr. Williams could present, while restricting testimony from discrimination victims who could verify the necessity of her intervention. These limitations represented strategic efforts to isolate her actions from their civil rights context, while creating artificial procedural violations that could justify disciplinary action. The psychological toll of defending her actions while continuing to implement comprehensive reforms tested Dr. Williams' resilience and commitment to civil rights enforcement, despite facing potential career consequences for pursuing accountability measures that challenged entrenched discriminatory practices. The stress of simultaneous investigation and reform implementation required careful time management and emotional discipline that drew upon her years of experience navigating institutional resistance to equity initiatives. The strategic approach that Dr. Williams developed for addressing the administrative hearing included maintaining focus on documented evidence of discrimination while refusing to allow procedural disputes to obscure the fundamental civil rights violations that had motivated her investigation. Her testimony emphasized the legal obligations that required immediate action to protect minority students from continuing discrimination regardless of administrative convenience or institutional preferences. The witness testimony that supported Dr. Williams' defense included statements from transportation personnel who had observed discriminatory practices while lacking authority to address systematic problems through established channels. These accounts provided independent verification of the institutional failures that had enabled Morrison's behavior while demonstrating that her investigation addressed widespread problems rather than isolated incidents. The expert analysis that Dr. Williams presented during the hearing included statistical evidence of transportation discrimination patterns that extended beyond individual driver behavior to systematic bias in resource allocation, route management, and supervision practices that violated federal civil rights requirements. This data demonstrated that her investigation addressed institutional problems that demanded comprehensive intervention rather than limited disciplinary action. The cross-examination process revealed the weakness of allegations against Dr. Williams, while exposing the coordinated nature of resistance to her civil rights enforcement efforts. The questioning strategies employed by complaint supporters demonstrated sophisticated understanding of administrative procedures, while revealing limited knowledge of discrimination law and civil rights enforcement requirements that justified her actions. The deliberation period that followed the administrative hearing created additional uncertainty about Dr. Williams' professional future, while affecting the implementation timeline for transportation reforms that required sustained leadership to achieve permanent institutional change. The delayed tactics represented strategic efforts to undermine reform momentum, while creating opportunities for discriminatory practices to re-establish themselves through informal channels. The preliminary findings that emerged from the hearing process indicated that Dr. Williams had followed appropriate procedures for addressing civil rights violations while acting within her jurisdictional authority to investigate transportation discrimination that affected educational equity throughout her region. These initial conclusions validated her enforcement approach while confirming the legitimacy of comprehensive reforms that addressed systematic institutional problems. The coalition building that occurred during the administrative hearing process included partnerships with civil rights organizations, educational advocacy groups, and community leaders who recognized the broader significance of Dr. Williams' efforts to address transportation discrimination through comprehensive accountability measures. These alliances provided sustained support for reform implementation while building political pressure for administrative vindication. The legal precedent that the administrative hearing established included recognition of regional transportation officials' authority to investigate discrimination complaints that revealed systematic civil rights violations in local district operations. This precedent strengthened future enforcement capabilities while confirming that civil rights obligations superseded administrative convenience and procedural preferences that had previously protected discriminatory practices from accountability. The institutional learning that resulted from the administrative hearing process included enhanced understanding of resistance strategies that opponents of civil rights enforcement employed while developing improved approaches for implementing equity reforms that anticipated and addressed procedural challenges before they could undermine substantive progress toward discrimination elimination. The personal growth that Dr. Williams experienced through defending her civil rights enforcement actions strengthened her resolve to continue pursuing transportation equity despite institutional resistance, while providing valuable experience that would enhance her effectiveness in addressing future discrimination cases that required comprehensive investigation and systematic reform implementation. Dr. Keisha Williams recognized that the administrative complaint filed against her represented an opportunity to demonstrate the broader institutional resistance to civil rights enforcement, while building a more comprehensive case for systematic transportation reform throughout North Carolina. Her strategic response transformed what opponents intended as a career-ending attack into a platform for exposing the sophisticated mechanisms that protected discriminatory practices from accountability through procedural manipulation and bureaucratic intimidation. The documentation strategy that Dr. Williams developed during the administrative hearing process included comprehensive analysis of similar cases nationwide, where civil rights officials faced retaliation for challenging systematic discrimination in educational transportation services. This comparative research revealed consistent patterns of institutional resistance that employed administrative procedures to undermine enforcement efforts while protecting established practices that violated federal civil rights requirements. The national coalition that Dr. Williams assembled during this period included transportation equity advocates, civil rights attorneys, educational policy researchers, and federal officials who possessed expertise in addressing systematic discrimination through coordinated legal and administrative action. These partnerships provided access to resources and strategic guidance that exceeded what individual state officials could access independently, while creating sustainable support networks for continued reform implementation. The media strategy that emerged from her legal team's recommendations included proactive engagement with journalists who specialized in civil rights issues and educational equity concerns. The controlled release of information about her case demonstrated how administrative procedures could be weaponized against officials who pursued accountability for discrimination, while highlighting the broader significance of transportation equity as a fundamental component of educational access for minority students. The federal intervention that Dr. Williams successfully secured through her Department of Justice contacts included assignment of specialized civil rights investigators to conduct independent analysis of the administrative complaint while examining the institutional culture that had enabled such retaliation against legitimate enforcement activities. This federal involvement elevated her case beyond state-level administrative disputes to national civil rights enforcement priorities that commanded significant political and legal resources. The legislative testimony that Dr. Williams provided before the North Carolina General Assembly's Education Committee included detailed presentation of evidence regarding transportation discrimination and the institutional resistance that enforcement efforts encountered from administrative personnel who benefited from maintaining discriminatory practices. Her testimony contributed to proposed legislation that would strengthen civil rights protections for government officials who faced retaliation for pursuing accountability in educational services. The academic research collaboration that Dr. Williams initiated with transportation policy scholars at Duke University and the University of North Carolina created opportunities for rigorous analysis of discrimination patterns while developing evidence-based recommendations for comprehensive reform that could serve as a national model for addressing transportation equity in educational settings. This research partnership provided additional credibility for her enforcement approach while generating peer-reviewed publications that documented systematic problems. The training program development that Dr. Williams pursued during the administrative hearing period included creation of comprehensive civil rights education curricula for transportation personnel throughout the Southeast region. These educational initiatives addressed the knowledge gaps that had contributed to institutional tolerance for discriminatory behavior, while providing practical guidance for implementing equity-focused service delivery that complied with federal requirements. The technology enhancement initiatives that Dr. Williams implemented included deployment of advanced monitoring systems that tracked transportation service quality across demographic groups while identifying potential discrimination through real-time statistical analysis. These technological tools provided objective evidence of service delivery patterns that eliminated subjective interpretations and created permanent accountability mechanisms that would prevent discriminatory practices from re-establishing themselves through informal channels. The community organizing efforts that developed during the administrative hearing process included establishment of transportation equity monitoring committees in affected school districts. These grassroots organizations provided ongoing oversight of service delivery while creating channels for reporting discrimination that bypassed administrative personnel who had previously dismissed or minimized complaints from minority families. The legal precedent development that Dr. Williams pursued through coordination with civil rights attorneys included strategic litigation in federal court that would establish stronger protections for government officials who faced retaliation for enforcing anti-discrimination requirements. These legal initiatives aimed to create binding precedents that would discourage future administrative attacks on civil rights enforcement while strengthening accountability mechanisms for systematic discrimination. The policy innovation that emerged from Dr. Williams' comprehensive approach included development of model transportation equity standards that other states could adopt to prevent discrimination while ensuring compliance with federal civil rights requirements. These policy frameworks provided practical guidance for implementing comprehensive reforms that addressed both individual misconduct and institutional practices that enabled systematic bias. The professional development opportunities that Dr. Williams created during this period included establishment of a National Transportation Equity Institute that would provide specialized training for government officials who encountered resistance when pursuing civil rights enforcement in educational settings. This institutional innovation addressed the isolation that individual officials often experienced when challenging systematic discrimination while building capacity for sustained reform efforts. The international attention that Dr. Williams' case attracted included invitations to present her enforcement approach at conferences in Canada and the United Kingdom, where transportation discrimination had been identified as a significant barrier to educational equity for minority and immigrant populations. These international presentations demonstrated the global relevance of her reform strategies while creating opportunities for comparative research and policy development. The data analyses innovations that Dr. Williams developed included sophisticated statistical models that could detect subtle forms of transportation discrimination that operated beneath traditional oversight mechanisms. These analytical tools provided early warning systems for identifying emerging bias patterns, while creating evidence bases for proactive intervention before discrimination complaints accumulated to crisis levels. The institutional reform proposals that Dr. Williams presented to state transportation administrators included comprehensive restructuring of oversight mechanisms, accountability procedures, and personnel evaluation systems that would prevent future retaliation against civil rights enforcement while ensuring systematic compliance with federal requirements. These reform recommendations addressed the structural problems that had enabled both Morrison's discriminatory behavior and the administrative attack on her enforcement efforts. The vindication that Dr. Williams achieved through the administrative hearing process included formal findings that her investigation had followed appropriate procedures while addressing legitimate civil rights violations that demanded immediate intervention. The hearing officer's conclusions validated her enforcement approach while establishing precedents that would protect future civil rights investigations from similar administrative challenges. The expanded authority that resulted from her successful defense of the civil rights enforcement actions included enhanced jurisdiction over transportation equity issues throughout the Southeast region. This authority expansion reflected recognition of her expertise, while providing additional resources for implementing comprehensive reforms that would prevent discrimination across multiple state jurisdictions. The leadership recognition that Dr. Williams received following the administrative hearing included appointment to federal advisory committees that would develop national standards for transportation equity in educational settings. These leadership positions provided platforms for advancing reform initiatives while influencing policy development at the highest levels of government. The institutional transformation that her strategic pivot achieved included fundamental changes in how transportation departments throughout North Carolina approached civil rights compliance. The comprehensive reforms that emerged from her case established new standards for personnel training, supervision practices, and accountability mechanisms that would prevent future discrimination, while ensuring respectful service delivery to all students regardless of racial background. The mentorship relationships that Dr. Williams developed during this period included guidance of younger civil rights officials who faced similar challenges when pursuing accountability for systematic discrimination in resistant institutional environments. Her experience provided valuable lessons about strategic thinking, documentation requirements, and coalition building that enhanced the effectiveness of future enforcement efforts. The systemic impact that her strategic response achieved extended beyond transportation services to broader recognition of how administrative procedures could be manipulated to undermine civil rights enforcement across multiple government agencies. The precedents established through her case provided protections for officials in education, housing, employment, and other sectors who encountered institutional resistance when pursuing accountability for discriminatory practices. The personal growth that Dr. Williams experienced through successfully defending her civil rights enforcement actions strengthened her confidence in challenging systematic discrimination, while providing valuable skills for navigating complex institutional dynamics that characterized high-stakes civil rights cases. Her enhanced expertise positioned her for continued leadership in addressing transportation equity issues while inspiring other officials to pursue comprehensive reform despite potential professional risks. The Southeast Transportation Equity Coalition that Dr. Keisha Williams established in the aftermath of her administrative vindication represented a fundamental shift from individual enforcement actions to collaborative institutional transformation that would address systematic discrimination across multiple state jurisdictions. The coalition brought together transportation officials, civil rights advocates, educational administrators, legal experts, and community organizations who possessed complementary expertise in addressing the complex challenges that prevented equal access to educational opportunities for minority students throughout the region. The founding conference that Dr. Williams organized at the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina attracted over 200 participants from 12 states who had encountered similar transportation discrimination patterns in their respective jurisdictions. The gathering provided opportunities for sharing enforcement strategies, documenting systematic problems, and developing coordinated approaches that would leverage collective resources to achieve comprehensive reform that exceeded what individual officials could accomplish through isolated efforts. The strategic framework that emerged from the coalition's collaborative planning process included standardized documentation procedures for identifying transportation discrimination, shared legal resources for pursuing federal enforcement actions, coordinated training programs that would enhance civil rights compliance across participating jurisdictions, and unified advocacy initiatives that would influence policy development at both state and federal levels through sustained political engagement. The research partnership that Dr. Williams facilitated between the coalition and major universities throughout the Southeast created opportunities for rigorous analysis of transportation equity patterns, while developing evidence-based recommendations for policy reform. The academic collaboration included scholars from transportation planning, civil rights law, educational policy, and public administration who possessed specialized expertise in addressing systematic discrimination through comprehensive institutional change. The federal agency engagement that the coalition pursued included formal partnerships with the Department of Transportation, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. These relationships provided access to enforcement resources, technical assistance, and policy development opportunities that strengthened local reform efforts, while ensuring consistency with federal civil rights requirements and administrative procedures. The technology initiative that Dr. Williams championed through the coalition included development of sophisticated monitoring systems that could detect transportation discrimination patterns across multiple jurisdictions, while providing real-time data analysis that supported proactive intervention before discrimination complaints accumulated to crisis levels. The technological infrastructure created shared databases that enabled comparative analysis while protecting privacy rights of affected students and families. The training program standardization that the coalition implemented included comprehensive civil rights education curricula for transportation personnel throughout participating states. The educational initiatives addressed knowledge gaps that had contributed to institutional tolerance for discriminatory behavior, while providing practical guidance for implementing equity-focused service delivery that complied with federal requirements and professional standards. The legal advocacy coordination that emerged from coalition activities included strategic litigation in federal courts that would establish binding precedents for transportation equity requirements, while strengthening protections for government officials who faced retaliation for pursuing civil rights enforcement. The coordinated legal strategy maximized resources while ensuring consistent approaches to complex constitutional and statutory issues that affected transportation discrimination cases. The community engagement initiatives that the coalition developed included establishment of local transportation equity monitoring committees in school districts throughout the Southeast. These grassroots organizations provided ongoing oversight of service delivery, while creating channels for reporting discrimination that bypassed administrative personnel who had previously dismissed or minimized complaints from minority families through established complaint resolution procedures. The policy development activities that Dr. Williams coordinated through the coalition included creation of model transportation equity standards that state and local governments could adopt to prevent discrimination while ensuring compliance with federal civil rights requirements. The comprehensive policy frameworks provided practical guidance for implementing reforms that addressed both individual misconduct and institutional practices that enabled systematic bias through administrative negligence or deliberate indifference. The mentorship program that the coalition established included systematic pairing of experienced civil rights officials with newer professionals who encountered resistance when pursuing accountability for transportation discrimination in their respective jurisdictions. The structured guidance relationships provided strategic advice, emotional support, and practical resources that enhanced effectiveness while reducing isolation that individual enforcement officials often experienced when challenging entrenched discriminatory practices. The international collaboration that Dr. Williams initiated through the coalition included partnerships with transportation equity advocates in Canada, the United Kingdom, and other developed nations where similar discrimination patterns had been identified as significant barriers to educational access for minority and immigrant populations. The global perspective provided comparative analysis opportunities while contributing to international best practices development for addressing transportation discrimination. The corporate partnership initiatives that the coalition pursued included engagement with transportation technology companies, bus manufacturers, and educational service providers who possessed resources and expertise that could support equity-focused reform implementation. The private sector collaboration created opportunities for innovation while ensuring that commercial interests aligned with civil rights objectives rather than perpetuating discriminatory practices through inadequate attention to equity considerations. The legislative advocacy that the coalition coordinated included testimony before state legislatures and congressional committees regarding the need for enhanced transportation equity protections and enforcement mechanisms. The unified advocacy approach maximized political influence while ensuring consistent messaging that emphasized both the legal obligations and practical benefits of addressing transportation discrimination through comprehensive institutional reform, rather than limited interventions. The data-sharing agreements that Dr. Williams negotiated through the coalition created unprecedented opportunities for analyzing transportation discrimination patterns across multiple jurisdictions while identifying systematic problems that required coordinated intervention. The collaborative data analysis revealed regional patterns that individual state investigations could not detect, while providing evidence for federal enforcement actions that addressed interstate discrimination networks. The professional development initiatives that the coalition implemented included specialized training programs for government officials who encountered resistance when pursuing civil rights enforcement in educational transportation settings. The comprehensive educational opportunities addressed technical knowledge gaps while providing strategic guidance for navigating complex institutional dynamics that characterized high-stakes discrimination cases involving multiple stakeholders. The public awareness campaigns that the coalition coordinated included media outreach strategies that educated communities about transportation discrimination as a civil rights issue, while highlighting successful reform initiatives that demonstrated practical solutions for achieving equity in educational service delivery. The communications efforts built public support for continued reform implementation while exposing institutional resistance that attempted to maintain discriminatory practices through procedural manipulation. The evaluation framework that Dr. Williams developed through the coalition included systematic assessment procedures for measuring progress toward transportation equity objectives while identifying emerging challenges that required adaptive responses. The comprehensive evaluation approach provided accountability mechanisms while ensuring that reform initiatives achieved intended outcomes, rather than creating symbolic changes that failed to address substantive discrimination problems. The sustainability planning that the coalition pursued included long-term funding strategies, institutional capacity building initiatives, and leadership development programs that would ensure continued progress toward transportation equity despite political changes or administrative transitions that might affect individual enforcement efforts. The comprehensive sustainability approach created permanent infrastructure for addressing transportation discrimination through sustained collaborative action. The recognition program that the coalition established included awards for transportation personnel, administrators, and community advocates, who demonstrated exceptional commitment to equity and civil rights compliance in educational service delivery. The recognition initiatives created positive incentives for continued improvement, while highlighting successful practices that other jurisdictions could adapt to their specific circumstances and challenges. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.